Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm back. Well, I'm back. So I have got two cameras here. One is on my laptop right in front of me, and the other one is on my right side here. So I'm not looking into your eyes. I'm sorry, but because my slides are here, so it's a bit, complicated. And please bear with me. What I'm going to do in this session is to go through my slides a little bit and tell you where we are, and I give you some examples of the application of some of the theories and models into the assessment of speaking, and I hope that you'll find it useful. So let's get started with the first slide, which I went through and explained in class. But let me just draw some beautiful geometric shapes here for you. The first model we discussed was Himes model, which is a response to Chomsky's competence and performance model. Then we talked about possibility, feasibility, appropriacy, and what is actually performed, and a bunch of vocabulary that has been introduced to the field of maybe linguistics, cognitive sciences, and even psychology of language, and of course applied linguistics and language assessment. Later was these terms were adopted by language assessment people. Then Canali and Swain's model, which was the first communicative competence, one of the first communicative competence models, which was adapted in language learning and also language assessment later. And finally, Lyle Bachman's communicative language ability, which includes knowledge of language, topical knowledge, strategic competence, personal characteristics, plus affect or psychology of the learner, and features of language use, which include test takers, test tasks, and so on and so forth. So let's move on to our second slide here, the very beautiful triangle, which we already have discussed in details. So tests are like sitting on the tip of the iceberg. The underlying features of the test are called constructs. That's whatever the test or the task measures, and the constructs are usually built upon a theory of language, which we call model. One of the models which we will discuss in this session is the competency-based or task-based model by TOEFL. Sorry, I need to make a correction here. Models are of two types: competency-based and task-based, and one of them is TOEFL 2000, which we will elaborate on, of course, briefly. So we also discussed the very famous model of Bygate, model of speaking, which has three components on the knowledge side and three corresponding components on the skill side. So for knowledge, we've got planning, we've got selection and production, and we've got counterparts on the right side. I'm not going to go through it because we discussed it more than enough, I believe, in class. This is one of the competency models which was used has been used basically in language assessment and language learning. And we also made a comparison between the framework I have proposed in this paper and this model, and we just found that there is a match between some of the components of speaking and oral presentation model. And at the same time, we also noted that there are some specific differences, including the fact that some of the components in oral presentations are not reflected in speaking models. Then we also discussed TOEFL's COE model, which is specifically being developed and validated for the test of English as a foreign language, which is really interesting because most often models are not developed to test, but they're just models, and a language tester goes out there in the field, finds the model, and finds it appropriate for his context or her context and then just adapts it or adopts it. But TOEFL's story is a bit different. The model was initially developed and validated for the sake of assessment. It's very interesting. We discussed this, that what I'm going to discuss today in a bit more detail is this one, test specification. So as you remember, test specification has got three components: construct specifications, task specifications, and assessment specifications. So what are these exactly? For construct specifications, I should remind you of four important components. So what is the first one? Assessment context. We have to articulate what our assessment context is. For example, Singapore's primary school, Singapore's secondary school, and then if there are different streams or different paths which we can find in Singapore schools, you can also spell it out in construct specifications. And when you specify the context, then you move on to a brief description of test. What is it exactly? How is it administered? Is it, for example, a computer mediated sort of test, or is it a one-on-one sort of test like an interview? Then you move on to construct in context, which is speaking. And under this, you got to articulate the sort of components that you're going to test in your assessment. For example, grammatical skills or task fulfillment, which we just discussed last night, of course under the assessment of writing, but it also applies to the assessment of speaking. Construct in context is like that, and then you got to find a relationship between the theoretical framework or the theoretical model you have chosen and the construct you have developed. So this is called construct specification stage. And you move on to the task specifications. And then now you use your construct to develop your tasks, which is the second stage. What do you do under task specification? Of course, three things. One is development of rubrics and instructions to use rubrics. Instructions for whom? For raters, because rating is an indispensable component of performance assessments. So you have to articulate it clearly as possible, how the rubrics have to be used by raters, naturally. So if you're asking me, are there any examples of some good rubrics out there which I can show you? Yes, of course. I have chosen TOEFL speaking rubrics, which are actually two tasks: independent and integrated speaking rubrics. So what does a rubric include? Look on the left-hand side, you will see that there is a scoring scale. This is technically a scale, and it's not a part of the rubric. The rubric itself is here. General description, delivery, language use, and topic development. Therefore, this is an analytical rubric or analytic rubric, meaning that a rater who is marking the performance of a student or a test taker has to come up with 4 scores on every performance. One is on topic development. For example, if the response is sustained and sufficient to the task, and so on and so forth. And language use is primarily about vocabulary and grammar, and complex structures, and whether there are any systematic or non-systematic errors there which are noticeable. And finally, delivery, which here means fluid expression or well-paced flow, and so on and so forth. And finally, a general description, which is, I think, a final score or something like that. So then you will give a score of 4 if everything is good. Then for integrated speaking rubric, you will also have the same thing: topic development, language use, delivery, and general descriptions. But because it's an integrated sort of assessment, they have developed a different one, because the element of integration makes the assessment somewhat different. Back to our slides, it was an example of rubrics, and instructions were not there, of course, but I can show you another example where we can find instructions. For example, here is directions for scoring. This is one short paragraph of instructions of how to use these rubrics. Okay. After instructions, we have to describe every task. Let's say we've got two tasks, an integrated task and an independent task. Then describe them, define them in details, and provide an example if possible, a very good or two very good and representative examples. Then administration plans, how are you going to administer it? Which one comes first? Which one comes second? The time that you're supposed to spend on each of the tasks, and every other information that would help the rater who is interviewing the student. And finally, assessment specifications, including criteria and scales, which I actually have already shown you. This is a scale. Let me go back to TOEFL. This is a scale 4, 3, 2, 1. And last night I told you how a scale can be developed. Can I just remind you of it? Just to refresh your memory, let me just show you the scale development plans or methods discussed by North and Schneider in their wonderful paper published in 1998 in Language Assessment. They specify 5 important ways of developing scales. Number 1 and 2 are basically based upon discussions, which we covered last night. Intuitive identification of key features. It can apply to both writing and speaking. And this paper is primarily about writing, but it applies to speaking as well. And number 2 is the discussion of raters and then development of a yes-no binary algorithm, which again I covered last night, so I'm not going to go through it. Number 3, 4, and 5 are empirical techniques. Number 3 is a sophisticated technique called discriminant analysis of factors. So if you want to have more information, please see Fulcher 1993. Discriminant analysis is basically like a clustering sort of analysis where you come up with factors, and then the discriminant analysis will differentiate factors and will cluster them together. And number 4 and 5 are also empirical, but they're done through rush measurement, which again would fall outside of the scope of this short presentation today, but we can always discuss it in class. The best source for getting information for section 5, 4, and 5 is of course the paper itself, North and Schneider's paper. Now going back to rules for scoring and rating forms and other guiding documents, anything that can help the rater understand how to score better should be put here, assessment specifications. Okay, and if you change your assessment specifications or task specifications or construct specifications, what do? Of course, you're going to keep a history file where you say, okay, on this date, what I changed was this, and the reason is this. Then you're going to have a dynamic and evolving test specification document, and every change, the date of the change and the reason for the change is clearly documented by you, which is going to help people who will use it in the future. And last but not least is a conclusion, conclusion slide. Of course, this is not the conclusion to my presentation. I still have one more document to present to you. So we have discussed that tests, constructs, and models are 3 indispensable components in every assessment. And there are 2 types of models, competency-based and task-based. Under competency-based, we have communicative competence, communicative language ability, and speaking as a process model, the Bygates model, if you remember, and task-based model, primarily TOEFL 2000 COE model. And this is, as I mentioned, is unique because it has been developed primarily for the test of English as a foreign language, or TOEFL. And like I said, I don't know of any other tests which have got their own specific theory or model. So TOEFL from that perspective is unique. And we also discussed in class that assessing oral presentations is a special mode of assessing speaking, but it does have some distinctive features like nonverbal communication specifically, and that's it actually. And of course, this is meant to be a question for you. Test specification components are, if you remember, there were construct specification, assessment, and task specifications. Now, let me just quickly go through the activity we performed in class. It was a collaborative presentation, if you remember. I asked you to map one construct to a model of language competence or communicative competence, and you did it, then you presented it. Then based on that, I asked you to think about what was happening as you were trying to fulfill the task and present the results of your discussion. And you said there were several language components which you were using in order to be able to fulfill the tasks. Expert one, that's student one, he has proposed that there were interpersonal components, there were problem-solving skills, decision-making skills, and so on and so forth. Expert 2 has proposed turn-taking, for example, goal setting, summarizing, and so on and so forth. And if you go through the list, which I'm going to upload, by the way, don't worry about it, categorization, clarification, justification, you'll see that there is a rich set of components here which can inform your construct if you want to develop a construct for assessing students in classroom who are involved or engaged, let's say, in such an activity. I'm going to take your ideas about what you did as expert judgment. So this way of developing construct is going to be pretty much like number one, intuitive identification of key features at different levels. That's what we have done. We can do further analysis on this to see how psychometrically viable and reliable these components are, all of them, and do something like what number 4 and number 5 have suggested, meaning that we can add Rush measurement part or even discriminant analysis, which is number 3, in order to further validate our construct. And the other stage or step would be to provide a match between these components and a theory of language, for example, communicative competence or Buckman's communicative language use. And if we do so, after that we will develop a scale, for example, from 1 to 5. Interpersonal, for example, interpersonal skills of the presenter from 1 to 5. Decision making from 1 to 5, and so on and so forth. Then we train the raters and we operationalize the test and we collect the data and we see how the data look. If the data look good, then everything has gone well. If there is a problem in the data, it indicates that our construct and perhaps even the model of language needs some amendments. So it's going to be an iterative process where you get information and feedback from the data you collected, and you try to resolve any potential issues in some trial rounds. And then if everything goes well during the trial, then you can just administer the test in an actual assessment setting, and hopefully everything will go well. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to stop this. If you have questions and problems, please just let me know. Have a good day. Goodbye.